Welcome to Ashling's Answers, the channel where I answer questions about geography, politics and science, mostly because my parents are sick of listening to me talk about this at the dinner table. So thinking back to studying geography at school, there's one theory that, although really outdated, I vividly remember being taught, but we only looked at a few of the issues with it, despite there being quite a few, which I later learned at university, and so I thought I should make a video about it. So whether you think back to school fondly or not, you probably remember being taught this. It's the Rostow Model. So as a quick refresher for everyone who was looking absent-mindedly out of the window in this geography lesson, the Rostow Model depicts a linear path of economic development with 5 stages. The first stage is traditional society, which is characterised by subsistence farming or hunter-gathering. The second stage is preconditions for takeoff, whereby there are surpluses being traded and manufacturing begins. The third stage is takeoff, in which industrialisation and urbanisation increase. And the fourth stage is drive to maturity, where urbanisation rapidly increases and there are a diverse number of industries, but industries adopted earlier on begin to decline. And the fifth stage is the age of high mass consumption, where there is a shift from manufacturing to the service industry and there is mass production of consumer goods. So I don't know if this is something your teacher had you do, but I vividly remember the teacher picking people from the class to go up to the whiteboard and write names of countries along the model where we thought they fit. And this is a simple enough task if you believe, as it says on BBC Bitesize, it is possible to put any country of the world onto one of the stages. In fact, it was even a question on the OCR geography specimen paper from the new syllabus they introduced in 2015. Students were instructed to study the diagram of Rostow's model of economic development and then answer the following question. For an LIDC you have studied, suggest which stage of the Rostow model it has reached and give reasons for your answer. And this isn't a one-off. If you throw a handful of key search terms into any search engine, you'll find numerous questions written by exam boards and teachers and tutors, all aimed at GCSE students, trying to get them to place a country somewhere on this model. And yet this model is problematic and has not been well regarded for decades. So why is it still being taught to students? So some teaching material that I found online did point out a few of the criticisms of the model, but the emphasis of the syllabus and the exam questions is very much on using the model rather than critiquing it. And I think that if they're still going to teach this model, they need to invert that, and the focus needs to be on the critiques, because I actually think there's a lot to learn from them. I mean, the best illustration of this is that I vividly remember writing certain names of countries on the board, and I completely forgot all the critiques. It wasn't until I was studying development as part of a geography degree that I realised how misguided some of my views on development were, and I think part of that comes from what you're taught at school. So let's delve into some critiques. I'll start with the ones that I see mentioned in the teaching material, because that's clearly what the syllabus thinks that students should know. So firstly, the model assumes that all countries start from the same place, the same resources, the same climate, the same population, structure and density, and obviously that's a complete oversimplification. We know that's completely not true. Resources are not evenly distributed, climates are incredibly variable, and population structure and density varies massively for each country. So we're not getting off to a good start there. So secondly, this model is based on the path that some European countries actually took, and is better as a description of the path they took rather than as a predictor of the path that other countries would take. Especially since European development came at a cost to other countries through colonialism, using their resources and their labour force. It means that if colonialism is required for this model to work, then it's not going to work for the countries that were colonised. So they may have had their resources plundered, which will make it much more difficult to begin the process of industrialisation, especially at a large scale. They also might be excluded from beneficial international trade because there are still uneven power dynamics in global trade, which hark back to the power dynamics from colonial times. And they also might be financially burdened by paying back loans because they were manipulated into these unfair deals. That's a video for another time. I'm looking at you, IMF. Also, if colonialism is necessary for this path to development, then that's not something that countries should be striving for or even would want to do, as we've seen the devastating effects that this has. A third critique of this model is that it doesn't take into account technological advancements. And this is less of a criticism of Rostow himself, because how was he to know that mobile phones would come along and change everything? But it shows how outdated this model is and makes me question why we still use it. So at school, I was taught about this idea of leapfrogging, whereby a country in its development would skip out certain stages that other countries, read England, had taken. So for example, instead of getting a national landline network, they went straight to mobile phones. But the idea of leapfrogging falls into the same trap of Rostow's model. It assumes that the European path to development is the norm, and so any sort of differentiation from that needs a special term, but they're still on the path, but they're going a different way. Why can they not just have their own path to development? They don't have to be following this path and wiggling in and out. They're on a totally different trajectory. Instead of trying to shoehorn countries into this model and claiming they're leapfrogging stages in European development, we should think of them as having their own path to development. So this leads me into a couple of critiques that I haven't really seen in the teaching material about this model, but that I learned while I was studying it at university. So this model presents development as a journey towards a pre-decided goal, which was decided by the West based on what they think modernity is. And using this model is problematic because it can be used to explain away global inequalities by claiming, oh well, yes, that's awful, they're experiencing that, but it's because they're at stage 2 and they just need to develop more and those problems will go away. Which means that their place on the path to development is used as a scapegoat, when actually the real reasons behind some of these problems are a lot more insidious and a lot more deeply entrenched in history and structural inequalities. It paints the Western way of life as the ideal, and then other countries are indexed based on how they compare to that. I mean, do I have to say any more? So academic geographers for over 2 decades now have been discussing the idea of multiple modernities. So there's not one idea of modernity that all countries are developing towards, but there are actually multiple. There are as many modernities as countries and places, because everyone's on their own path. And the fact that the reference I'm using for this is from 1995 shows how outdated Rostow's linear model of development is. This view of multiple modernities contests the idea that European ways of life are the ideal and that everyone should aspire to that. The idea of multiple modernities contests the idea that some countries are ahead of others on this invisible scale of progress. And yet this assumption of the scale of progress is still being taught to students. So secondly, the motivation for the creation of Rostow's model is arguably as political as it is academic, which in itself is interesting and I think should be included in the syllabus. So Rostow created this model in the 1960s, which was in the Cold War, and his model is very much tied in to the American foreign policy of that era. The Rostow model is also a direct rebuttal to Karl Marx's theory on modern history. So explicitly so that the full title is The Stages of Economic Growth, a Non-Communist Manifesto. It's got a political ideology in the name. I think that shows how politically motivated this model was. So this model could be used to justify the United States asserting its influence in countries around the world, in the fears that the USSR would be doing the same, to try and gain influence but claiming that they were helping countries on their path to development. I think this is a great illustration of how politics and academia can be intertwined, and I think it's a great lesson to teach students. I think all secondary school students could understand the critiques I've laid out here. They're quite simple and I think they're engaging, so I don't understand why the model doesn't focus on these critiques rather than on the model. In fact, discussions on this model could be a fantastic segue into the topics of Eurocentrism and paternalism and colonialism, and really get conversations started in classrooms. You shouldn't have to wait till university to discuss topics like this, they should be in the syllabus. I'm sure updating the curriculum takes time, but some of the things I've referenced were published in the 90s, and the human geography of the 1960s is not the human geography of today, and I think that the school curriculum should reflect that. Do you remember being taught this at school, or have I made this whole thing about one experience? Let me know in the comments below, along with anything else that you had taught that you later found out was quite inaccurate or very much one side of the story. I'd be really interested to hear from you. If you like this video, give it a like and subscribe so that you can see more videos like this. And if you have any questions about geography, politics or science that you want me to look into, I'm a student, I have a lot of free time. then let me know in the comments below, and like maybe the next video could be about something that you're really interested in. On that note, I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to you tuning in to the next video. See you then!